Druv, man, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great, Peter.
I'm very excited about this show, as you know. The moment I read that first part of your Bitcoin Astronomy series, I was like, I've got to make this show. I've got to talk about this show because I don't know, man. The first part the whole series has blown me away, but the first part especially. And I'm gonna say, if anyone's listening, I know everyone won't do this, but I do recommend jump in the show notes and at least read part one, or go and listen to Guy Swan narrate it before you get into this interview. But firstly, I have to ask, like, where did this come from? Like, why did you attack this subject?
I think it's interesting for me for a variety of reasons. I'm kind of a sci-fi nerd. I'm a physicist originally by training. It's fun for me to contemplate these kinds of esoteric aspects of Bitcoin. I think I'm a problem solver and a technologist, and that also makes it fun. So that's the best answer. It's fun to think about these things, and that's why I do it. But I would say I can try to rationalize it with some other better reasons that I kind of discovered in the process. And one is that this is a classic physics thing. Like when you extremize one variable, you kind of can simplify the problem, and you can maybe understand the core thing better. You know, physicists are famous for considering perhaps unrealistic, idealized, extreme scenarios to help them. As intuition pumps, we sometimes say, to understand a problem space better. And for me, this idea of like considering Bitcoin or blockchains more generally in space, far, far apart, like macroscopically, like many minutes or hours in terms of light travel time apart, it's a very extreme scenario, but it helps expose some of the underlying issues that a blockchain has to solve around consensus and communication, making sure the entire peer-to-peer network is seeing the same mempool and so on. So that's fun. And that helps me understand Bitcoin right now, here, today, a little bit more. And so that's exciting. And then I think this is something that Phil Geiger, one of my friends and colleagues that I work with at Unchained, I think his assertion is that if there's perhaps a lot of people who get into Bitcoin because it has cool cryptography, or it's a fun, new, interesting kind of database, or it solves a money supply problem that they worry about, or it protects privacy, or there's so many reasons, right? Bitcoin is multifaceted. And Phil's statement was, maybe this is what gets some real hardcore science fiction and physics and astronomy nerds to come join the flock. And, we could use Bitcoiners of all stripes. So maybe that's even a third reason.
Well, we should do a bit of a setup for people, because there will be people listening who'll jump straight into this. They won't go and read it, or they might go and read it afterwards, and they might be thinking, what the hell are we talking about? So, like, I'll kick off by saying, look, this is a 3-part series that you've written. And for me, it felt like a mix of you theorizing about how Bitcoin works, or blockchains themselves work in an interplanetary system. Where colonies maybe are on Mars and the moon, but you've mixed it with a little bit of kind of fiction. Like, you've kind of done a little bit of, like, this could be turned part of it into a story, because you start to theorize about how societies might develop on different planets. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think one of my fantasies would be if someone who's a better writer and storyteller than myself would take some of these kind of speculative scenarios and really write something interesting. Like if folks have seen The Expanse television show or read those books, it's like a pretty popular, very modern and often described as very realistic take on what colonizing, the solar system might look like. But The Expanse almost never talks about money, and science fiction almost never talks about money in general, because maybe science fiction folks think money is boring, but money is interesting. The more that I learn about it, the more interesting it becomes, and Bitcoin especially is interesting. And I think there's some great connections between Bitcoin and blockchain and time and energy and consensus, back to ideas that science fiction nerds can enjoy. And that's again part of what was the motivation for setting this whole thing up. But yeah, we're talking about Bitcoin in space, and we're asking ourselves, will it work? What will happen? And to connect back to the other side of why fictionalization is interesting and fun here, is because ultimately, I do, especially in part one, I think I provide some quote unquote results, like some experiments and some simulations that I ran that help support some of the conclusions that I'm making. But I ultimately rely upon an argument about human nature and what humans are going to want in the future. And in order to motivate that argument, I kind of need to help the reader understand what it might be like to be those humans. What would their recent history have felt like, and why would they want and feel a certain way? And so that I felt was easiest to communicate and most fun, perhaps, like by trying to tell a speculative future history, right? Like almost like a science fiction documentary of like what happens in the future. I might argue that like, again, a much better storyteller than I, but someone like the author of World War Z that takes like a fun speculative idea, but then tells it in a really realistic kind of found media kind of way. Like this is my like really small attempt at trying to do something similar in a Bitcoin world.
Just another thing to add into it. When I was reading it originally, the first part, there were two films I was thinking of. It just sparked an interest. But retrospectively, there's something else I've been watching that's come to mind. So the two films that came to mind for me, I don't know if you've seen them. I'm assuming if you're a space nerd, there's a good chance you have. The original Total Recall.
Yeah, of course.
So obviously when they end up on Mars, right? And they do end up, like at the end, you don't know if it's real or not, but they kind of terraform Mars and it's like, okay. I thought of that, but I also, the recent Brad Pitt film, Ad Astra, and the reason I thought of that... I have not
seen that one.
Well, there's an interesting bit that I won't give too much away, but they go to the moon, and when they get to the moon, they land there, and you see a subway, right? So it gives you this idea that at some point... well, for example, have you seen this thing that's on Apple TV at the moment called For All Mankind?
No, but I've heard about it. I'm familiar with it. I'm actually excited to watch it at some point.
Yeah, it's really good. So the idea, the loose idea being is there's like, again, I won't give too much away, a slight spot, slight plot spoiler, but not really. You end up with two colonies on Mars, Russia and America. So these are very early, and these are just like just astronauts. But you extrapolate that out and think further, you know, if you do end up colonizing these places, whether it's the moon, whether it's Mars, whether it's Ad Astra's subway, or any of these scenarios, you're going to need a medium of exchange. You're going to need some economy. You're going to need an economy. You're going to need money, right? And if you sit down and talk to your partner and my good friend Parker Lewis, he'll tell you how important money is, right? So considering your writing and considering the scenario where you need money, you have to put yourself in this kind of post-hyper-Bitcoinization world and have to say, so you have to say Bitcoin is the money.
Yeah, I think coming back to your point about money, there's a new trend in the way that the government, NASA, and that some of the big space industry companies talk about our return to the moon, which is happening, with this Artemis program or whatever. And there's this idea that like maybe last time we went there just to prove something, but proving something isn't going to create an impetus to be able to stay there. And last time we went there kind of off the back of government largesse and huge, some might even argue malinvestment with, a sort of space industrial complex. And if instead this time we go back, we as a species go back and under a more kind of commercial like banner, then we have to sort of justify commercially every step that we take. We have to make launches more profitable. We have to like have reasons why people are going there. People have to pay for it. And of course, that brings money more clearly into the picture. So I think one could write generally about how money and economics in space is going to be interesting. And it's going to be interesting just in general. But as a Bitcoiner, I want to write about how Bitcoin as money in space is going to be interesting. And so I asked the reader right up front in part one to accept like one more hypothesis is that like, look, it's Bitcoin. Like, I don't want to have. If you believe in ETH, go ahead. That's fine. That's your thing. But you may not. Maybe just read the rest of the article and replace Bitcoin with ETH if you like. That's not really the point, right? But you have to sort of accept that something like Bitcoin, and maybe ETH is a bad example in this regard, but you have to accept that something like Bitcoin, in particular, something that uses proof of work and that has like a block time, and something like that is what wins. I believe that's going to be Bitcoin. But my goal with this article series is not necessarily to inflame that old argument. It's more just to project forward. So say, Bitcoin or like Bitcoin-like blockchain wins, hyper-Bitcoinization happens, the entire Earth's economy shifts over to that. First of all, what does that even look like in large scope? And then as we play out and start to, as a species, colonize other planets and export, therefore, our money, our Bitcoin into those places, what's the reaction? How do they adapt? And I think going back to your two movies, I haven't seen Ad Astra, but obviously who pays for the subway? Like what's the subway token in the moon? Like, well, is that a Lightning Network transaction? How does that work? How does that even connect back to Earth, right? Not a question most people exploring space might ask, but as Bitcoiners, we're compelled to ask these questions. And then I think your example of Total Recall is a great one. Again, not to spoil the movie, but a significant part of the subtext of the plot is a revolution on Mars for greater independence. And I think there's this general insight that as we get further away from centers of power, as we settle farther, it's always been true in the history of human expansion on the planet, right? As we get far away, we want to get away from mom and dad. We want to build our own empires. We want to build our own states. We want to have our own independence. We distinguish and differentiate as culturally, and then we want our own identity as a result. And I don't see why Mars or Pluto or wherever we go is going to feel any different. They're going to have a strong sense of cultural identity based on being Martian. And then the series kind of picks up with, okay, well, how does that affect their interactions with Bitcoin? And then we start to get into the real issue, which is Mars is just really far away. So this is different than a group of people moving to the center of Australia or the center of Canada and deciding to start a Bitcoin citadel. Bitcoin's going to work fine there, right? This isn't a cultural question necessarily about self-identity as much as it is how that question intersects with Bitcoin and blockchains, given the large distances that intervene between the planets. So that's really kind of the entry point for some more quantitative questions around, well, how does Bitcoin work over such a distance?
And you know what? This stuff isn't that far-fetched, right? Because, okay, firstly,
in the beginning, it's not. You're right. It starts out kind of realistic.
Well, but if you think about it right now, we have commercial space flight programs at the moment. Richard Branson has one for Virgin Galactic. Certainly, SpaceX, you would expect to get there at some point. Is Jeff Bezos? Is that Blue Horizon? I think. I can't remember the name. Blue Origin, that is it. You've got the US talking about going back to the moon. You've got the Russia and China talking about agreeing a moon base, which will mean the US has a moon base. And it feels natural if you're going to go to Mars, then perhaps you want to establish a base on the moon first to test some things out. And as you said, that you've got this need to commercialize it because people will want to go on holiday to the moon. And then you have this scenario whereby, look, when I first got into Bitcoin, I say properly 4 years ago, when I was really going down the rabbit hole and I first heard Pierre Rochard talk about hyperbitcoinisation, like I was like, yeah, all right, look, I like Bitcoin, but come on. Now I'm like 4 years down the road, I'm like, holy shit, no, this could and probably will happen. Maybe not for every nation on earth to begin with, but like, I can see it happening. So I can see the pieces of the jigsaw for your work. I can see all the pieces, right? And it's just kind of picturing them coming together. So this takes it to the first interesting point, and I've got like multiple questions. But you talked about, when you're talking about how blockchains work and blockchains work in space, you talked about the fact that people in this interplanetary scenario, whereby we've had hyperbitcoinization, they are living on different planets. They will need a form of money. They will likely hold Bitcoin, and they can even transact with Bitcoin as long as they can, sign a transaction. But there are some issues with the, for example, mining. Right? You couldn't really mine on other planets. And you talk about this center of hash. Look, I'm doing a terrible job here. Do you want to explain the concept, and I'll throw my questions at you?
Yeah, sure. So again, it's kind of like, this is why the narrative is kind of useful. So you imagine, what does it look like when we're settling Mars? Elon Musk and SpaceX, or whoever you want to say is responsible for that, is investing huge sums of wealth in doing so. Bitcoin is continuing to grow. That's right now. That's already happening. But project both these trends forward 10, 20, 30 years. If Bitcoin, again, if we experience hyper-Bitcoinization and Bitcoin becomes the money supply, that becomes how we're investing in order to support the Mars program. Maybe you get Bitcoin for moving to Mars and being one of the first million colonists. And maybe that's such an incredible thing to 30 years from now, the amount that's being offered, that you decide it's worth it. That's not unusual in the history of settlement, of wild continents that we're trying to tame. But when you get there now, again, we're positing, like, it's interesting to talk about money, but we're positing that it's Bitcoin, that we've hyper-Bitcoinized. So can you use Bitcoin from Mars? Well, yeah, you can. You can use it pretty much the same way that you might use Visa or any kind of other system, more or less, if you're a user, right? Like, you can hold, access to a Bitcoin private key, and you can hear about blocks on the network. They're assuming that there's a network transmitting data to you, which secretly I think is maybe what Starlink is setting up to be able to do. Maybe it's not just about the Earth. Maybe it's about other places too, right? Bandwidth in space is a very valuable commodity. So assuming that you have the bandwidth, you can listen for blocks. You can run a Bitcoin node. You're going to be out of sync, right? You're going to be like 20 to 45 minutes out of sync with what's happening on Earth. And That's not because Bitcoin sucks or like Satoshi's a bad engineer or like we haven't written the future yet. It's because Earth and Mars are 20 to 40 light minutes apart. Or I'm not quite saying that. Maybe up to 45 light minutes apart. I think the lower limit might be smaller. But the point is, you're going to be out of date a lot. But that's okay. You're just a user, right? Most users don't even run their own Bitcoin nodes. They're using Coinbase or something like this, right? So no matter what custody looks like in the future, and I hope it does look like collaborative custody. Of course, that's what Unchained focuses on, and that's what we want to promote. But in the future, like no matter how you're custodying it, you can still use the Bitcoin. It's going to be a bad experience, right? Like today, you're having to send a transaction and it hits the network in a few seconds, and you have to wait an hour. If you're on Mars, you have to wait 45 minutes to get the transaction to the miners on Earth, and we'll talk about more about why the miners are on Earth. And then you have to wait another hour maybe for it to confirm, right? So it's a little bit less good of an experience, but you can use Bitcoin. You can probably use layer 2s like Lightning, right? And you can make Lightning nodes with people on Mars, and that can be really fast. And you can therefore use Bitcoin as a transactional currency, and that makes sense because in the hyper-Bitcoinized world, people are using Bitcoin for that on Earth, right? So you're used to that, and you can achieve that on Mars. So far everything is great, and probably this is how everything starts, right? This is probably how the colony gets started. That when they're on the colony and they go to the little liquor store in the colony depot, like they're paying in Bitcoin, maybe, through a Lightning channel or whatever we have figured out at that point, however far away this is. I don't want to pin us down to today's technology necessarily. But something interesting, I think, happens when the colony grows, right? As they get bigger and bigger and bigger, they're no longer 100 or 1,000 or even a million people. They're tens of millions of Martians. That's a substantial population, and it's only going to get larger. Like they're starting to develop their own cultural identity, and what they're noticing is that all their transaction fees accumulate back on Earth. Now, why is that? It's for a really simple reason. They can't mine Bitcoin on Mars effectively. If someone were to start, if they were to throw up a Bitcoin miner, and because they can run full nodes, right? So they can connect to the network. But if they were to throw up a Bitcoin miner, I'm also simplifying here, by the way, a little bit. I don't think today Elon could ship a laptop with Bitcoin node on it and connect, even other than bandwidth. There's some time stamping problems and whatnot, but those are all solvable. We can skip over that. So they can run a full node. Why can't they mine? Well, they can't mine ultimately because, again, the time lag gets in the way, right? Imagine there's one miner on Mars and there's a whole bunch of other miners on Earth. The rest of them, like the very first miner on Mars, right? First guy tries to do it. As that miner gets blocks, those blocks are already 20 to 45 minutes out of date. He tries to add more blocks on the end. By the time he wins, let's even argue, finds a block, he sends that block back to Earth. In the meantime, 4 more blocks would have been found, right, by earthly miners that he hasn't even seen yet, and then they arrive at him. So I think Clark Moody put it really well in an article he'd written about this topic earlier, several years before me, which was basically it's too little hash rate at too far a distance to be able to maintain consensus with the mining pool, right? And that's the important part. Go ahead.
So I just want to break that down into just some basic steps, so people listening are understanding, because I know this stuff comes natural to you. So what we're saying here
is too fast.
No, it's good. But what we're saying is if I want to send you some Bitcoin now, I'm here, you're in the States. I can get it into the mint pool in seconds. And I know it's going to be about an hour, but because of the distance between the Mars and Earth, the time it would take for that message to get from Mars to the Earth would take up to 45 minutes. But it gets in there. Right. Eventually gets in there, yeah. and then I've got to wait for my 6 confirmations. I may want to wait more for whatever reason, but so it's good as a settlement layer still. If I don't mind a few hours. But it's no good for as a transactional layer, which people occasionally use it for. As I know people don't buy cups of coffee.
You could still use it as a transactional layer. I think in my hypothetical future Mars world, if you tried to build a Lightning channel, let's say between Earth and Mars, you'd be subject to the same time delays. So that would be awkward. But for example, you could be in a Lightning network with your neighboring Martians. And that would be fast, and that would work just great. And then, yes, if the two of you had to settle, you would have to flush back to the network on Earth, and that would take time. But that's symmetric for both of you, right? So
yeah, and that's just a scenario you get used to. That's a scenario you get used to.
Exactly. You suffer with it for a while as a Martian.
But the other thing we're really starting to talk about here is economic productivity generated from the blockchain, in that by the time this is a reality, we'll have gone through multiple halvings. And what we're seeing is that over time, the block reward for the miners is going to be made up more of transaction costs and less from the actual Coinbase block reward. And what you're saying is, all the margins here are they've basically they're sending Bitcoin back to Earth in terms of transaction, but they're not keeping any of the productivity because nobody's mining there. But they can't mine because of the latency on the blockchain. Now, if the blocks
that's the crucial connection. Exactly right. Like, why can't they just mine themselves and keep those fees? Right.
So say blocks were 1 or 2 hours, could it then work?
Yes, indeed it could. And so this is the result, right? Is that like as soon as a blockchain designer chooses a block time, like they're making some kind of claim around how much time it takes the blockchain to gather, pending transactions and mint them into blocks, but they're simultaneously making a claim about a few other things. We already know that block time affects things like orphan rate and so on, right? As you decrease the block time, you increase the orphan rate, right? This is the number of forks, colloquially, and the number of blocks mined that don't wind up into the long-term blockchain. But it turns out the block time also sets a certain physical scale, right? Simply because light and space are connected, special relativity. Right? There's a maximum signal travel speed in the physical universe, and we believe that's the speed of light, which means the largest, like this is again an approximation, the largest on some level, or I shouldn't say the largest, maybe the characteristic scale of Bitcoin in space, therefore, is approximately equal to its block time. Now, 10 light minutes ain't very far in the solar system, right? It's big enough to encompass the moon. The moon is about 2 light seconds away. So on Luna, the great cities that are built there or whatever, people will be able to use Bitcoin. They'll suffer a minor delay as they kind of connect back to Earth or whatever. That's okay. It's a couple seconds. But moreover, they're probably going to be able to mine over there too. They'll be able to build mining equipment, and they'll be able to keep transaction fees local on Luna should they care about that, because they're very close to Earth. But Mars is like many minutes, sometimes up to 45 minutes away. And for a block time of 10 minutes, that's going to be too long. If Satoshi had designed the block time to be several hours, it could easily have included Mars and maybe Venus or Mercury or whatever, right? But there would have been a further distance at which point it stopped working, maybe at Jupiter or at Saturn or Pluto, or certainly the next star over, right? If we really want to get abstract and get out there, there will always be a limit. So a blockchain is a physical, in space and time, it's like a bounded box, right? That's an important thing to realize about it. And that choice is made the second you pick the block time for it. So Ethereum has a block time of a few seconds, right? And is using proof of work right now. But a large part of these arguments will still carry over, even if the proof of stake, even though I don't believe proof of stake long-term is a sustainable solution to these problems, but that's irrelevant. By choosing a block time of a few seconds, Ethereum has a much higher uncle rate. And so they try to have a different, reward policy that rewards uncle blocks and so on. So they have to deal with that problem. But they also restrict their blockchain size to be much smaller. It's only going to be a few seconds in diameter. It barely will reach the moon, much less anything further away. Now, again, that might not matter because as long as you can get to the moon, what's between the moon and the next planet? Nothing, right? But to a certain extent, it's just important to know that when you fix this time, you fix the scale. The words that I use in the article to describe these concepts I describe the idea of a center of hash. And that's really what I mean by where is the Bitcoin blockchain? Well, it's on the planet Earth, but where is the mining happening? Also on the planet Earth. If you kind of average where the average location of all the miners are, it's somewhere near the core of the Earth today. It's kind of a silly idea, but it kind of represents where the center of mass of the Earth is. It's somewhere in the core. And the center of mass is a useful idea in physics when we're trying to describe the overall gravitational properties of the Earth. So similarly, the center of hash, where most of the miners are weighted by their hash rate, is a useful idea when we want to try to think about how blockchains interact at very long scales. And the claim that I make in the first article, which I support through some simulations that I ran and whatnot, though I think you can get there analytically if you spend a bit more time than I have, is as you get farther and farther away from a blockchain's center of hash, so in the case of Bitcoin, as you get further and further from the planet Earth, the effectiveness of your ability to mine degrades. So the same hash rate, at the center of hash, it gets a certain amount of blocks. And as you move away from Earth to the moon, it degrades maybe a tiny percent. And as you move way, 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 way further out, the further you get, the less blocks you seem to win with the same amount of hash because you're further away and that latency penalty starts kicking in. At some point, you simply can't win any blocks anymore. And so it's like there's this curtain or horizon, I call it a hash horizon, which surrounds every blockchain. And my claim is that Bitcoin's hash horizon is at most a few light minutes wide, which is too small to contain other planets like Mars. Now, coming back to the future history, why is all this relevant? Because it means, exactly as you said, Martians can use Bitcoin, they can invest in it, they can hold it long term, they can even transact with it locally on Mars very conveniently, maybe less conveniently with folks back on Earth, but they can never mine. And if they can't mine, what does that mean? So today we think of Bitcoin mining as what? It's like a weird thing that some people do to get Bitcoin. It helps, keep the network running and blah, blah, blah. But if in my supposition, we're in a hyper Bitcoinized future world, then mining is much more than that, right? Mining is, on some level, it's unified with the energy production industry. It's part of what makes, it's part of what optimizes our ability to go find and discover and operationalize energy sources, because it creates, this floor for the price of energy, and that lifts the market. And so mining is viewed as like this important thing for an economy. Like if your economy doesn't have mining, how are you going to optimize your energy production infrastructure? How are you going to make sure everything is as efficient as possible if you don't have that natural blow-off valve, so to speak, of hash rate to coordinate everybody around? So Martians are going to feel like we're building energy grids like they used to in the 20th century over here, right? Where we're getting inefficiencies, like here in Texas, where we had the snowpocalypse recently, right? With inefficient and poorly maintained energy grids, that would never work if Bitcoin is or Bitcoin mining is really integrated well with energy production, because it's so liquid and so well monetized. So I think there's a desire of a futuristic, hyper-Bitcoinized culture to want to mine. The mining is a virtue. And moreover, they don't, even if the energy thing is like less of a concern, though I think it's an important one, what you stated is really important too. Like you're sending all your fees to those people over there, those earthers, right? Like, and there may be some cultural animosity.
It's kind of a trade deficit in some ways.
Indeed. It's a mining deficit. It's a mining gap, right, between the users and the community on Mars and everyone on Earth. Everyone on Earth mines in this future vision, right? It's not like mining is just it's part of the infrastructure of the energy economy. So every energy producing facility, which might be your house or your solar panel, is perhaps also mining to a certain extent. It's just everywhere. And Martians just can't do that. And so what's their solution? And I propose that they will start their own blockchain. And now everything will work in reverse, because Earth is so far away from their blockchain. All our tremendous hash rate won't be able to affect them. We won't be able to participate meaningfully in their blockchain. Like their miners will become the ones who drive that blockchain forward. And so this is a really interesting moment to me. When I first convinced myself of this, it was like, I maybe don't like the phrase Bitcoin maximalist as a label for myself. I think mostly I just don't like joining things, but I'll accept, small m maximalist as a description. As a Bitcoin small m maximalist, how could I be so comfortable and cavalier with saying Bitcoin is limited in this way and that people will eventually rebel, quote unquote, against it and start their own currency? And then I sort of had to admit to myself, well, I already believe that Bitcoin is limited in space and time because of the choice of block time and the hash horizon. So maybe it's natural that separate colonies get their own chains, and that somehow the universe wants us to spread out, and that wants us to build these new blockchains. And indeed, perhaps that's part of what's exciting about proof of work blockchains, is that why would you go settle all these other planets? Why would you even want to? Well, what if you could start your own blockchain? You can't do that here, right? We've learned that lesson, or we're learning that lesson now, right? ICOs fail, altcoins collapse. People who want to start their own blockchains, who want to have the immense demonstrable financial gains from doing so, can't. And we don't know that today in today's market, but maybe 100 years from now, we do know it. It's in our bones. We get that that's not how it works. There's one currency, you build it, everyone uses that. That's what Bitcoin taught us. But if Bitcoin's, it can be used everywhere, but if it can't be mined everywhere, there's a real reason why a fork of Bitcoin that does exactly the same things as Bitcoin does, that just happens to have started on Mars and mined chiefly by Martians, is meaningfully different. And that's an interesting conclusion to reach. I enjoyed a lot of the conversations at Unchained between myself and other folks, talking about this idea, where I think I convinced a few people at least who may have started out on, no, dude, Bitcoin is the universe's currency. We're going to use it we're going to use it as we settle the stars. And to realize, well, maybe it's just for Earth, and it's sort of pause, is that not enough? That's okay, right? We can build one currency for our entire fucking planet. That's okay. That's an okay thing. That's still an admirable goal. We don't have to feel as Bitcoiners that we somehow failed if that first currency can't be used on every planet of the cosmos.
Well, there's an interesting intermediary step, which is the human factor in this. So, and this you can only speculate, but if we if we think beyond the basic colonization of Mars, perhaps we have millions of people there, terraformed, etc., which is all theory, but let's just assume it's happened. You suddenly we don't know what the governance structure for Mars will be or how it will evolve. But what we should expect, based on the history of humans, is that people will want to self-govern. And in the end, the people on Mars will not want to be governed by the people on Earth who have a different, rules. They're far away. It takes how many is it? Like a 4-month journey from Earth to.
Today, it's very long. It's like 9 or 18 months. Like, it takes a long time for us to get to Mars.
Well, let's assume some better technologies. They can go quicker, but at the same time, people always want to self-govern. We have we can look at examples all around the world where people want to self-govern. So I think there could become you could expect a revolt, you could expect a coup, you could expect Mars to want to govern itself with different rules, and at that point, if their currency is Bitcoin, they're still essentially a slave to the currency of Earth.
In a sense, and I think we might today be like, oh, that's a weird conclusion to reach. But again, in a hyper-Bitcoinized future world, Bitcoin is so plugged into every aspect of your life. It's not just this settlement coin that you speculate around and make memes over, right? It's transactional. You invest in it long term. You get paid in it. There's potentially other layers that exist on top of Bitcoin, like much of the internet and much of technology may be, settling down or motivated or plugged into economic incentives that connect on Bitcoin in some way. So it's really central to you. You may even view it as a way that you achieve political identity. Like, I'm not a big put elections on the blockchain guy. Like, that's not what I'm saying as directly and as simply as that. But I think there are connections between Bitcoin, blockchains, money, and identity and political representation. And I think on Earth, we will be running those experiments over the next 100 years. Bitcoin is interesting not just because it changes the money, but because it reconfigures global power structures. We're not going to have society that looks exactly the same afterwards. And I hope it's better. I really do. But it's going to be different. And in the future, this idea of like your currency and your coin and your mining and like all that connects and defines a big part of like who has power over you and like who controls your life is going to be natural to assume. And just consider the very simple idea that like, if Earth and Mars ever go to war, which happens all the time in science fiction books, right, about colonization and settlement of Mars, what if earthly miners just decide to censor all Martian transactions, right? How would they know they're Martian transactions? They're coming in over the damn comm link, right? They're not coming in over the phone wires, right? Or whatever mechanism that they have. If all the miners are on the other team, there's a reason to feel unsafe in times of conflict. And so that may be another motivation for faraway colonies to decide to take things into their own hands.
Which means we potentially get Mars coin.
I called it Musk coin. In a blatant attempt to get Elon Musk to read the article. But something like that. Listen, maybe I think is what happens.
I mean, just a slight segue, but you saw the new job titles that him and his I did. I can't remember. Was it his finance director who took yesterday, Master of Coin? Perhaps he's already thinking that far ahead. Perhaps he's already considering, well, if we are on Mars, will we have Doge? Will it be Bitcoin? Will it be Musk coin? You never know.
I want to conjecture that if he knew about some of these fun ideas, he'd be into them, but maybe not. Maybe he already knows about them. Maybe he already figured them out and he's just way ahead of all of us and he's out there doing it. Or maybe he's just saying dumb shit on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? I took that actually a strong signal yesterday. Because was it Parker? Did Parker put up the SEC filing up on Twitter as well?
I'm not sure, but I definitely saw a bunch of people talking about it.
I think Parker put it up. The SEC filing to actually confirm that. But I took that as a strong signal that he's come to that realization of how important this is. Maybe he's got that bias because he put 1.5 billion in and they've made more money on that than they've made on selling cars. But at that same time, I think he's coming to that realization of how important Bitcoin is. So for him to be thinking that far ahead would not surprise me at all. Maybe not as far ahead as you, but for him to be considering the important role that Bitcoin is making, a generational impact, that wouldn't surprise me.
No, and I think that's why, people are eager on some level to run all these experiments, right? People want to go to Mars. They want to. It's clear that there's so much excitement over a and I want to say excitement of a different kind, right? Like there's more sustainable excitement. It feels like right now there's so many more invested players that are excited about space and space exploration than perhaps ever before. The cost, and Elon has already brought the cost of space travel down by a huge margin. I think, it's very difficult to imagine like where we would be without reusable rockets and what they've done to the overall cost of putting a kilogram of payload out into space. And you need, before any of the crazy speculations that I've engaged in can even happen, you need to just get into space more cheaply. And so I think Elon's pushing in a lot of really smart directions. Maybe, especially like your point, Elon, I think is really smart about getting funding from places. If it turns out that you can sit on an asset class that grows at 200% per year on average, maybe that's a really good source of funding to invest early in. And I think a lot of, hopefully, corporations are seeing that. That's why we're seeing this recent craze in, allocations in corporate treasuries.
So Musk coin. So the interesting scenario here is that is slightly different for Bitcoin is that Musk coin can't have the same immaculate conception that Bitcoin has. Bitcoin is unique. It is completely original in that Satoshi plugged the piece of the jigsaw together, but to create this new form of currency that never existed before in human history. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We'll come to that. I know what you're getting at with that, but it's a completely unique invention, and that has so many. It's just such a wide range and impact upon humans and money and how like you said, how we govern the political landscape. We could go on forever about that. Now, it could be from very early on that somebody wants to create a coin on Mars, and perhaps people are happy with Bitcoin to begin with, and it's considered a shit coin. Whatever scenario, there may be multiple tests. Now, that's a very different scenario because essentially it is like now, it's that like shitcoin race where someone's trying to prove it. But like you say, on Mars, there's actually a legitimate reason to have a separate coin. So is it something that's created by a central governance because maybe Mars has governance, maybe it isn't sovereign individuals, maybe it isn't private cities. Who knows what that scenario is? But it's a different scenario for the genesis of whatever that coin is created.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting to definitely conjecture about who will be motivated to do it and when, right? Like on some level, like if my article, touches any kind of nerve with anybody who makes it to Mars, maybe they start it the first day they get there. But it's going to fail, right, on some level, because something I explore in the article is that while it's true that the great distance that separates Earth and Mars gives Mars great defense against Earth's hash rate, it's also true that like this word defense is meaningful, right? That here's an example. If there existed an entity that had tremendous hash rate and suddenly posted on the internet today a copy of the Bitcoin blockchain that had the same Genesis block, but was like longer and had fatter, heavier blocks with more proof of work in them, it would destroy the entire Bitcoin ecosystem. Why? Because as soon as a node heard about that blockchain, it'd be like, you're the heavier chain. And it would go jump over to that chain and it would ignore the entire 500,000 or 600,000 block history that humans here, like in our real timeline, have created in this hypothetical example. I call that a hash bomb, right? If a blockchain shows up that has more weight than the real blockchain, but just like garbage transactions or no transactions, or allocates all the Bitcoin that's created or the token that's created to one central entity, the attacker, essentially destroys the entire economy, resets it to zero. And folks can get around it, they have to go, but it's very disruptive, right? You can imagine that would disrupt Bitcoin today, and Bitcoin is barely used by nothing but a few million nerds. Imagine in the future when we've had hyperbitcoinization, what a disaster that would be. Now that's not possible in Bitcoin because no one has more hash rate than the Bitcoin miner. So how would you produce such an object? That couldn't happen, right? Impossible. But if you're the first guy on Mars and you create Muskcoin and it's just you and your PC hashing on Muskcoin and some earthly miners hear about it and they laugh and they're like, this guy's an idiot. We're just going to build a bigger version of Muskcoin and they'll dedicate 1% of one facility's hash rate for 1 hour and they'll build a fake version of Muskcoin that has the same Genesis block as what you picked and they'll just send it over to Mars. It'll land, it'll destroy your entire network. So there's a sense in which it's predictable for both sides what the conflict might look like should they actually decide to be adversarial and try to mine against each other's chains and create havoc. Like a Martian miner knows essentially the multiplicative factor by which their hash rate gets multiplied through the large distance and latency. And like, I'm not sure what the exact numbers would be because all of this is very theoretical and speculative, but imagine that it's 1 to 100, right? So Martians would know that, look, until we get to 1% of Earth's hash rate, they're going to be able to destroy us very easily, just by some small number of them deciding to resist us and push back, right? So there's a sense in which if they're smart, Martians will discover a Schelling point. There'll be some moment where like they realize that, look, we now have like sufficient GDP and like energy production already online, where if we invested in like 3D printing a whole bunch of, ASIC miners, like we could launch Muskcoin and we could survive. Because remember, most people on Earth aren't going to care. Most miners are going to be like, oh, whatever. As long as I can keep mining, like I'm not going to give a shit about Muskcoin over there. It's only like some minority that are like motivated even to mess with this chain, right? On some level, they don't want to lose the fees, maybe, right? So there's some fraction of earthly miners that would say, like, screw those guys, I'm going to try and take their chain out, but most won't. So Muskcoiners don't have to defend against all of earthly mining. They just have to defend against people that are willing to fuck with them. And that's going to be some minority. But go ahead.
It depends on power structures and
that's true.
And governance structures and
people
the elite.
Coordinate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if there is an elite that is, for example, trading with Mars, very profitable trading with Mars, has a very profitable relationship, and all of that trading is done on Bitcoin, that seeing this almost revolt on Mars could be a threat to their income, and that could be that could be a point. Like, I don't know if we have nation states. I don't know if we have a global government or a half global, whatever it is.
Opposed interests, right? Like a Martian would have to just try to measure up. Well, who's opposed to my attempt to do this? What kind of hash rate could they actually realistically bring to bear? That, like, remember, every hash that they spend on attacking me is one that they don't get to spend on earning Bitcoin. So, like, realistically, how much hash rate can be summoned against me today? And the answer is maybe not that much, maybe a lot. I don't know. It'll depend, as you say, on the political configuration and climate at the time. Like, how contentious is the idea of Martians developing their own currency? I bet a lot of earthly folks would support it. They would say, like, it's their right to do that. Like, we're self-determined. They should be self-determined. There's going to be conflict and disagreement about it. But eventually, if they're smart, they'll measure. And they'll say, like, only now do we feel confident that we could resist, and therefore we should launch. And in terms of the Immaculate Conception, like, who will do it? I also think that's an interesting question because, again, this is the far future. Maybe we are good at launching distributed projects with no owners. Maybe we have methodologies and best practices. Maybe there have been hundreds of projects like that launched on Earth, not necessarily new blockchains, but maybe whatever, new, anonymous marketplaces or other kinds of structures. And we've gotten really, really good at learning how to manage distributed anonymous launches of projects. Maybe that's a skill that we have. Maybe there's an entire scientific discipline related to engineering those structures that got its start in Bitcoin. So I'm willing to believe that should they want to do it, they'll have the knowledge that we don't have in order to be able to understand how to do it, when to do it, and who to do it with.
Well, the successful people will be smart. I think we can all agree that Satoshi...
Dumb people will try and fail, and then eventually someone will really succeed.
Well, I mean, you only have to go back on the history of Bitcoin and look at the projects before Bitcoin, or the cypherpunks, or all the different projects and the attempts. Maybe it's the same scenario. Maybe there's the equivalent Martian cypherpunks, who are thinking through this deeply, thinking like you're thinking. Perhaps your research forms part of their research. They're having to consider all these scenarios. Perhaps they even put out a decoy blockchain while they work on another one. All these different. I mean, maybe that's it. But my assumption would be, perhaps it's even developed by AI with its own defense. These are all the things we don't know. But you would assume that if they're going to have to go through a test and learn process to create something to deploy. And at the point that it's, because the other thing is like that transitional period. It's like we would be talking about hyperbitcoinization here on Earth. They would have to obviously consider hyper-Muskcoinization. Is there a transitional?
They would be seeking it, presumably.
Yeah, and there's that transitional period where they're using Bitcoin, but some are using Muskcoin. And then does Earth ever accept Muskcoin?
And I think there's tensions there too, right? Not every Martian is going to support this. They're going to say, like, this is stupid. Let's just use Bitcoin. Like, it already works. Like, I don't give a shit about mining. Like, I don't believe all that stuff. Like, we'll figure it out. Like, don't upset the boat. And I think there's all these wonderful, American Revolution analogies and, Tories and redcoats and, freedom fighters and who are actually, maybe they're in manipulated in their own ways. And there's wonderful fiction, I think, to be written at this intersection one day. And that was one thing that I was trying to inject a little bit, is the sense of like, this is a revolution of a certain kind. And like any revolution, it needs leaders. It needs the right economic climate. It needs to have the right timing, right? And it's going to create problems after the fact, and vacuums that need to get filled and replaced and figured out. But it feels like also an interesting kind of revolution. Like it's like an economic revolution. Like it's not necessarily a bloody war. It's more like, both sides assemble their hash rate, like perform a calculation and determine that is or is not economically reasonable to continue to fight or whatever, right? Like that's the ideal bloodless version of this revolution. I don't know if it'll actually be that way.
Well, it could be an actual repeat of Bitcoin. You could have the equivalent Joe Weisenthal working for Bloomberg Mars, claiming that Musk coin is too volatile.
Yes.
I'm just going to keep using Bitcoin. You could have Nick Carter on the equivalent Nick Carter on Mars with his FUD dice around Musk coin that you've had with this transition away from the dollar towards something like Bitcoin.
There could be a glorious era of like many coins, right? It doesn't have to be like all of Mars is coordinated and they pick one coin and they launch it and everything is like solid. They could bicker and fight and like attack each other just as much as Earth could attack them. And in fact, that might be one of the best things for a misaligned Earth interest or antagonistic Earth interest to do, is just fund some Martians to launch a competing currency and say that it's better and try to convince people to use that one. So I think even Martians may recognize through their knowledge of history that, look, if we really want to nail this, we've got to do what Bitcoin did. And I don't know how that will work out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Right. But I agree with your point. Like people will try to start the project too early and they'll fail. And when time is right, you'll see a lot of people like competing to become what is Musk coin. Because imagine that, right? Like just like today, there's this feeling of like one of these currencies is like maybe going to become really big. Maybe some people believe many of them are, but like others believe just one is going to win because of various reasons. Which one is it? If you're on the wrong one, it doesn't matter how much you had, right? You have to be on the right one. So it creates all these tribal conflicts, and maybe those embroil Mars for a few decades as they're struggling with their own revolution. So I think there's a lot of fun speculation to be had here.
Their own revolution, their own civil war on Mars. Do you know one thing I hope about Mars? And I don't know if this will happen. I hope there are no weapons on Mars. I hope that's
no weapons.
I mean, it would be impossible because you're going to have printed, 3D printers, so it's almost impossible. But
nuclear weapons and spaceships and so on. Like, I think space is a dangerous place in general.
Yeah, so I think the next step then is, okay, Musk coin happens. There are colonies on the moon, Venus, perhaps on some of the moons of Jupiter. Like, okay, we've spread out through the solar system. There are now multiple currencies. We've got trading routes, trading partners between these planets. We've essentially created the same multi-currency world that we have now that exists in on Earth in the solar system, and we potentially get to that because your trading partners will take your coin. We'll take which one should we hold? We have a reserve. Maybe we have a basket of reserve blockchains. We have part Saturn coin, part thingy. We recreate that scenario. And potentially, in recreating that scenario, we might not have inflation, but there may be the argument that someone will say, we need one blockchain to rule them all across the solar system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where you kind of pick up in part two. That part one kind of says exactly as you're saying, like, if you believe us so far, then what you've accepted is that you can be a Bitcoiner and you can still believe that new blockchains will start far away because they can't mine. And so they need to mine, and so they'll start. That means many of them will potentially start. So now we'll go way forward. You have many blockchains. Isn't that just today's inefficient multi-fiat currency world? And to your point, no, it's not multi-fiat because we can't inflate these currencies, though. Maybe the Plutonian blockchain is very, very loose with their money supply, right? So maybe there are conflicts like that occur. Maybe there is more or less inflation. But you might imagine that in a healthy interplanetary economy, that these kinds of things like arbitrage and trading and cross-chain atomic swaps, right, which let us trustlessly exchange these different blockchain assets, these sorts of structures will help, even out the market, right? So probably Bitcoin continues to be the most valuable currency in the solar system because it's connected to all the wealth and, biological, intellectual, technological, the population of Earth, right? So it's very hard for me to see how Muskcoin is, market cap wise, worth more than Bitcoin, at least to start out with. But also over time, you can imagine, as like demographics and populations shift and change, like the solar system can support many trillions of human beings. They're not all going to live on Earth. There are going to become other power centers. And you might imagine that over hundreds or thousands of years, that as we settle the whole solar system, indeed, like other blockchains could become more dominant over time. So a little bit, you're right, like this paradigm of shifting like multiple currencies and then shifting balances globally as one or others are considered more reserved than some others. Because remember, everybody can hold everybody else's currency and trade it. They just can't mine except for on their own, right? And exactly as you're suggesting, people will start to ask, like, this seems inefficient. Like, is there a better way? Like, could we build a blockchain that all of us can just use? Well, first of all, like, you can all use Bitcoin. Like, you can hold Bitcoin and trade it anywhere you are. That's not a problem. You have to wait a long time, but for the things to go back and forth from Earth, where the center of hash of Bitcoin lives, but you can use it. So maybe the question is there, like, the reason we're not all using Bitcoin is because we all decided we needed to mine. That was helpful. Is there a blockchain we can build that we can all mine on? And part two kind of asks this question. And the real challenge is what we learned in part one, right? That like any blockchain is kind of fixed in space and time and that they're related. And so if you want people to be able to mine over a spatial volume that's the size of the solar system, if that's your hash horizon, to use my language, that's many light days in diameter. So that suggests that your block time can't be 10 minutes. It needs to be at least several days, maybe a week, maybe a month even, right? If you start to go at that level. So if you have a blockchain with a block time of a month or weeks or whatever, weeks to a month, what does that look like? In theory, it's large. Its hash horizon is large enough for everybody to now mine on it. But like, how long does a halving take, right? Like, how long do you wait for? You wait a quarter for a confirmation for a fully confirmed transaction in this. And I've called this blockchain that's the size of the solar system. I've called it Solcoin in part two, just to have a name for it. So you're waiting like months to confirm Solcoin transactions. I think like I talk about how it would take tens or hundreds of thousands of years to go through, halvings and produce the whole supply of Solcoin, whatever it was. Let's assume it just ran the same way Bitcoin did. So it's this crazy structure. And this is to me like an interesting constraint. As a physicist, I often think that like when there's a constraint that seems like you can't get around it, it's like actually a law of nature. That's a famous quote from Heisenberg. And so like, if we are struggling to build a blockchain that's this big, like that works the same, that has like a 10-minute block time and all that, maybe the lesson is we're not supposed to. Maybe we're supposed to, I don't know we're supposed to means in this context, but maybe what we're supposed to do is accept that in order to build a blockchain the size of the solar system that all, our city states and planets can hash within, we must accept an incredibly slower kind of pace. And then I suddenly realized that that's actually really natural for space at the scale that we're talking about. I mean,
unless you could relay messages through wormholes, which Einstein believes exist,
which is not part of my speculations. Yeah. I think if you can, it changes a lot of things, right? Because you just have your wormhole cell phone and you talk to your buddy instantly on Earth or whatever. I don't know. That changes the nature of this discourse.
There's another step there. I think that's quite interesting to think about as well. Is like, how does Solcoin come to exist? Do potentially with interplanetary colonies, interplanetary currencies? Do we have therefore certain hostilities naturally, like we do on Earth between countries? Is Bitcoin a bit like the dollar is right now? It's the kind of solar system currency. There's the equivalent of like the petrodollar, across the solar system, which is Bitcoin. And perhaps there's a group of kind of, I don't know, a group that are dispersed across the planets, and they're saying, it's Solcoin fixes this. Fix the money, fix the Bitcoin, fix the blockchain,
fix the money, fix the solar system. Indeed. It's interesting to conjecture, but at this point we're so far outside of the realm of stuff that we can reasonably talk about. But it's fun, right? And I think
I love it, man.
You're right in a sense. Like we there is risk, right? Like part of the reason that the Martians wanted their own coin is that they felt risk trusting the Bitcoiners over on Earth, because cultural walls can intercede, right? Great distances create separation, create new kinds of shared interests. If we can assume that different parts of the solar system, different colonies and stuff feel this kind of occasional mutual antagonism, well, they may not be comfortable collaborating or building projects or whatever. And then not to mention the inefficiency problem, which we kind of already addressed. I think there's also a long-term risk management problem, which is if Bitcoin, if you're, and this is the idea that I introduced in part 2, is I really do believe in the future, wealthy people and maybe not even, maybe average people, but certainly the elite of society will live a very long time. They will live for not 100 years, maybe 1,000 years, maybe 10,000 years. It's not insane to conjecture about technologies, biological or cybernetic, that might enable those kinds of lifespans. If you're one of the wealthiest humans and you expect to live for 10,000 years, where do you keep your money? If you keep it all in Bitcoin because you live on Earth, what if Bitcoin gets blown up? What if Earth is blown up? You know, if you can clone your mind, as we sometimes see in these kinds of futuristic scenarios, why would you keep your money in one spot? Right? You would spread it out. So maybe now you play the portfolio management game of you hold some Bitcoin and some Musk coin, some Pluto coin, whatever. This is another inefficiency that has been introduced, right? Might it be easier to hold Solcoin, a currency that cannot be destroyed by destroying any single planet, because its hash rate and its blockchain is spread out across nodes around the entire solar system? That's a very interesting construct. And Solcoin's time scale is so long that you live so long. Maybe you're the kind of person that routinely hibernates for 1,000 years while you wait for your investments to mature, because what your big game is, you're trying to get to the next star system. And so you're this elite person that's developing this technology, and you're told it'll take 300 years to build. So you just go to sleep and you expect your funds to be safe when you wake up. And you don't want to consider the risk. And it might be really interesting for you to operate at these long time scales, which is exactly what Solcoin delivers in alongside the solar system scale or hash rate market, hash horizon. That's right. So there's all these interesting connections between like getting bigger, time scale, like human ambition. And again, that's part of why I like to fictionalize some of this stuff, because it helps people connect, I think, a little bit to what these motivations might be for people.
There's a couple of other things we need to drop into that then, though. So there's the assumption, we're stretching out thousands, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 a year, but so we have solved the problem of potentially most death scenarios, apart from like certain accidents, but we solved the
solar system we know can support trillions of people. So what's a good way to get to trillions of people is if people stop dying.
Yeah. So certainly the aging problem. Do we call it a problem? I don't know if you call it a problem. We've solved aging when it's a problem for
some people call it a problem. He has one of my favorite lines, I think, ever that I've ever heard in a scientific talk, which is, well, what's the problem with aging? Why should we stop it? And he pauses and he's like, because it kills people. It's kind of like, we don't consider that, like, it's so natural to age and die. It's part of life. But people are pushing to solve that problem. Some of the same people that are settling Mars and building rockets are building life extension companies, because the two go hand in hand. The scale of space is so tremendous that if you live 100 years, you can't experience but a hair of it. So it's in your interest to create a future where you can both travel in space and live a very long time.
Yeah, and our man Hal Finney is cryogenically frozen, as I understand. So maybe he comes back to work on that project. But the other thing is to consider, actually, this might be a scenario whereby maybe it's not all humans. Maybe it's that scenario where it's mainly robots, and robots are designing these things. That's another thing we just don't know. But if Elon Musk has got anything to do with it, we're certainly heading in that direction with Neuralink.
No, that's right. And that's one of the best ways that you might have a long-lived entities. Even if humans don't achieve for themselves significantly long lifespan, maybe we're limited out. We can only live to 125 years, and maybe there's no mind uploading or whatever. If there are things like AIs, then those can be long-lived entities. I don't know whether they're benevolent, whether they have personalities, whether they're sort of mindless investment bots that just exist to like make money for their creators, or whether they have ambitions of their own, and secretly human civilization is directed by these timeless AIs while we're all just these ephemeral meat bags that consume and around them all the time. I think depending on your politics, perhaps your philosophy, your morality, you can project a lot of scenarios. But I think there's definitely a match between time scale, space exploration, and I'm arguing money as well.
Well, I guess in a scenario of whether this is robots as such, there is a problem you do solve in that you don't need to essentially terraform planets to colonize them with robots. All you need is energy. That's the only thing you need. You don't need food production. You don't need to worry about the supply and production of oxygen. So, yeah, you can colonize future planets with robots. Or I wonder if there's this kind of a humanoid in between, which doesn't require, like, part biological, but doesn't require food or oxygen. There is, I think of that film. It was a shit film. It was a Johnny Depp one where they like upload him to the computer. Those scenarios. You solve a number of problems for colonizing other planets. I mean, the two major problems is food production and oxygen. You don't need that.
Yeah, it's much easier to travel long distances if you don't have to keep biological things alive. That's for sure. And maybe that's part of what drives some of these changes in society at these long-term scales, is that we increasingly are not biological things, that we take on a different perspective that's much more centered around energy and less around resources. And I think that's another really deep connection, especially when we talk about going even further than other planets. If we're talking about going to other stars, like, I don't think it's generally appreciated, like, how much energy we're talking about when we contemplate ideas like that. It's fun for me, like in movies, when there's like the casual, taxi cab space or sized interstellar spaceship that some guy jumps out of, and he jumps back in and he goes off to another star. And it's just like, it's fun and cute, because the amount of energy, like, forget like a big spaceship with, sophisticated, all this stuff, just like a fucking rock, like the size of a taxi cab that's moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light, contains more energy than our civilization produces, like, annually, right, by many orders of magnitude. So just this idea of like, humans are going to like build a spaceship and go to the next star over in a short amount of time, and within a few tens or even a few hundred years, it requires energy that we can't even access today. So a question behind the question is, like, in order to do all these amazing things that we contemplate doing as we become an advanced civilization and do all these wonderful things, how do we afford the energy budgets? How do we build the structures which optimize human energy collection by orders of magnitude required to get to those kinds of outputs? And I think this is exactly the Bitcoin, criticism of energy usage, but inverted. Bitcoin is a hungry machine that makes us go liberate energy resources that we're not otherwise using, because we can put them to work hashing. And don't have to be adjacent to a supply chain or a market or a source of raw materials in order to be valuable economically. We just got to hash with them. And then we can turn them into real money. That idea applies at the solar system scale too. Like, our sun is streaming out so much energy in every direction, like all through, space, that we're not using. It's just being if you'd like, it's being wasted right now. It's just entropy being manufactured out into space. And if we could harvest all that energy, like, we could maybe be able to power things like interstellar missions. Maybe we could actually, become an interstellar species ourselves and ascend the Kardashev scale. If you've heard of that, which I talk about in the article, just become a more advanced species.
Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 civilizations.
Sure, yeah, like a loose categorization of civilizations by their energy budgets. Exactly. If we want to ascend that scale, we need a driver that causes us to always be hungry for more energy. And blockchains are proof of work. In particular, blockchains are great drivers, like, to do that. And so when we think of like Bitcoin, as I sort of conceptualize in part 2, Bitcoin as moving us like up the scale from being like a sub-planetary civilization to becoming like a planetary scale civilization that uses the full energy of the energy that hits the Earth's surface, because we're using all of it for Bitcoin mining. That's absurd. But because Bitcoin mining drove a virtuous cycle in the adoption of new energy resources and the building of new energy pipelines and pathways, and optimized and made more efficient our entire production pipelines. So similarly, I think that can happen at the solar system scale. But if you have a blockchain that incentivizes energy collection across the entire solar system, such as Solcoin. So there's this connection, again, between long time scales, huge energy, like money, ambitious projects, long lifetimes. I think, again, you could get around this if you could just make it so that everybody can mine everywhere, or you could get around this if people didn't hyper-Bitcoinize in the first place or something, and everybody just trusted the central bank of Earth. But I think these speculations are so interesting because they reveal ways in which Bitcoin, like we thought it was a money, we thought it was a consensus tool, but it might actually also be an energy optimizer. It might be an engine that takes us like straight to the stars, like over the course of 100 years. Like that's pretty cool. I'm not saying that's exactly what it is. It's more complex than that, and I'm simplifying greatly. But I love that it create like, in particular, I love that proof of work is this incorruptible, ungameable, like unpredictable thing that also creates like positive effects potentially for society's energy usage and infrastructure. That is still more conjectural, but I think that's what's happening. And following that trend is part of what this series is all about, and seeing where it takes us as a species.
Well, so what I really liked was this idea when then you talked about, because I've heard about these concepts of type 1, type 2, type 3 civilizations, and there was a thing that was, I think I'd say about a year ago, I don't know if you followed it, where there was like this kind of weird signals coming out of space, and there was this conjecture of like whether this was a planet that was harvesting the energy from the sun because of the something to do with like the blink of when the planet was, I don't know, something weird was going on.
Yeah,
I think you know what
pattern
I'm
of
talking
about. The light curve.
Yeah,
it was kind of like really the dips in the light curve of a famous star that astronomers were looking at over the last few years. That's right.
Yeah, and they couldn't work out what it was, and then we got these kind of like artist impressions of this kind of big matrix that was harvesting energy from the sun. And I mean,
those were exciting.
I was like, really? That's fucking cool, man. Is that real?
I think it turned out maybe it's something more natural, but like that doesn't mean that idea is unrealistic. But moreover, I love that like science fiction is again often talked about like, hey, one day advanced civilizations might build crazy structures like this. They never ask like who funds that structure. Like, how do they have such an incredibly huge energy like production pipeline to do this thing? They don't ask like what is the incentive structure and the government relationship between government and industry that causes is like why did they even build it, right? Like they posit crazy things like it was the project of our famous scientist, or our population was growing so we just decided to build this thing. Like they don't ask those deeper economic questions because there hasn't been like a framework that is interesting about money to apply to that context until we start to think about scaling up Bitcoin and blockchains and proof of work, because suddenly now it starts to connect all these ideas together. Again, that makes me a longer term believer in Bitcoin, helps me not worry about proof of work because I don't view proof of work as some massive weakness, like we're wasting energy. No, we're using energy, and the usage of that energy delivers all sorts of benefits. And in fact, it might shape our society over the long run.
This is where we should probably bring in the Fermi Paradox, though, and talk about the fact that we might never get there. So whenever I see the Fermi Paradox, I get this smile on my face because I read about it first on Wait But Why. You know that website, that guy writes these ridiculous long things. I'll put it in the show notes if nobody's read about this. But the Fermi Paradox is this kind of concept that we never reach. Why are there no type 2 or type 3 civilizations? Why have we never been visited by aliens? Who knows, we might do. You know, might have been we've seen some weird things coming out of if you listen to Joe Rogan, some kind of weird things are going on there. But like surely if the type 2 or type 3 civilizations exist, they maybe would have visited us, we'd be aware of it. Where are they? And the idea of the Fermi Paradox is that there's this like great filter that no civilization gets past because it always destroys itself.
Yeah, that's a common explanation, is that like I guess there's a tension, right, between like, because to be clear, it's not really a paradox if you just say like we're the only life out there. It's just us, and that's it. That's the solution. Like that is a perfectly acceptable solution. It's consistent with all the data that we have. It's just not very satisfying, perhaps. And I think it's a little bit unlikely. I talk about in the third part of the series that like life is probably common in the universe. Like it's just simple life, right? Like little bacteria or simple cells or things like this. We have a lot of reasons to believe that those are common. But the Fermi Paradox is saying, well, if the universe is so big and if simple life is so common and everything is so old, like surely there was enough time for a lot of things to evolve as we did into civilizations like ours and become curious like we are and go visiting, or at least send signals, for God's sake. Just shine light at somebody and let them know you're around. So why aren't people doing that to us? Why don't we see huge amounts of signals like that all over the cosmos, right? And there have been a lot of resolutions or proposed resolutions to this paradox. And I think, my favorites are typically in the class that you described, which is that there's some kind of filter often known as the Great Filter, a step that is difficult for a civilization to take, or an accomplishment that most civilizations don't make. And that prevents, as life as common as it is, from becoming commonly civilizations like ours. And of course, the most compelling question about the Great Filter is it in our past or is it in our future? Right? Did we already get past it? And so we're good. And because we became multicellular and we're going to be coasting all the way to galactic domination. And most planets just aren't able to get past single cellular life. They just get stuck there. Because if so, we're golden. Or is it in our future? Right? Like, if are we about to destroy ourselves in the next 100 years? Because as soon as you invent technology, you basically kill your planet because you have no idea how to control technology. Maybe that's the Great Filter. So that's a very depressing idea, that it's in our future and that every planet develops a civilization like ours, which then snuffs themselves out through nuclear war, or disease, or global warming, or some awful thing. So there's lots of different kinds of explanations.
I mean, I'm a believer that in a universe of a billion galaxies, which each have a billion stars, that mathematically it's likely that there will be other forms of life. I always remember a biology teacher when I was a kid. He was like, if there is other forms of life, you probably can't even imagine what they're going to look like. Yeah, scenario for the creation of that
that's,
life.
Of course,
and that
the
planet.
fun part, right? Like, I think I'm pretty honest about that in part 3. I think I'd open up and say, like, look, at the end of the day, we have no idea what. Like, we're so far now down the speculative territory that even I have to kind of pause and admit that I have no idea what is happening, and that we're just going to make some guesses, and we're going to try to follow our guesses, and we're okay with our guesses being wrong, but if our guesses are simple and uncontroversial guesses that we think are likely to be true, we have, if we're being Bayesians, like we have high belief in them as priors, if we like, then maybe our conclusions are like okay and worth listening to. And in the article, I try to offer some pretty simple initial guesses of what alien civilizations, should they be out there, what they must be like, and then we try to pursue the consequences. And basically, what I conclude is that, like, if they're out there, they have blockchains, and if they have blockchains and they're talking to us, they're sending us blockchains. And then I kind of try to pursue the consequences of that idea a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, look, that bit was quite a leap to say that they've come to the same conclusion that a blockchain is the is the perfect design for money, because we have to make the assumption that they are,
I clearly
they're
had
intelligent
a conclusion
life.
I was trying to reach.
Yeah. But and we don't know what they'll think. We don't know, like, where we would be classed amongst these. That, we might be like these amazing intelligent life, or we might be the fucking morons of the universe. Might be, look at those fucking idiots down there acting like fucking idiots. We've got no idea, right? Just no idea at all. Also, the other thing I think about with regards to, like, why haven't we seen signals or blah blah blah? Like, the universe is obviously a big place. We've dominated this planet, but I was reading the other day about, like, two new sharks have been found in, like, New Zealand or something or other. Like, we're always finding new species, so perhaps just we've not been found.
No, I think that's honestly the best explanation. It's the one I personally actually subscribe to, is that we haven't looked, and no one's looking for us, because the universe is huge and it takes so much time for signals to move through it. And we've only been around, we've only been aware in a universal way for like maybe 100 years, like since we had radio and other kinds of things. It would have been difficult for us to even notice signals from other places before that. Obviously, folks had come to visit us, we would have noticed it, presumably. But maybe that's just really difficult because, again, the universe is so large. I think that's just a very simple and, to me, very satisfying explanation, because it doesn't make any claims about who's out there. It just says, look, if they're out there, you haven't heard from them, and that's reasonable because it's just a huge place and you haven't run into them yet. It's only if they're like incredibly common, like every star system has them, that we would expect really to be inundated with signals and have something that we need to explain. If they're, hundreds or a few thousand civilizations across the galaxy comparable to ours, or much more advanced even, they're still really far away from us. The galaxy is huge. Like, it's kind of like saying, what if there were 1,000 tribes on all of Earth? Like, okay, fine, your nearest tribe is still hundreds of miles away from you at that point. You're unlikely to run into them no matter how much you've foraged. And it's going to take a long time for you to develop the perspective to realize how populated the planet really is.
Have you seen the Drake equation?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. So, so I've just drawn it up here. So in a universe aglow with 2 trillion galaxies, which I didn't realize, you would be supremely smug to think Earth alone hosts clever creatures. So blah, blah, blah. I can't remember what the actual number. Was it like up to like 100,000?
Yeah, we don't know. It's very sensitive to the assumptions you put in, right? And so I think that's like my attitude in this article is like, we simply don't know if they're out there or not. We know that it's possible. We think it's likely, but we know it's not like there can't be too many of them because we would have seen them in some way, but there still could be a good number and we would have no evidence, and that is completely consistent with all the observations that we've made. So on some level, it's my kind of like mea culpa to open the door and be like, all right, so I can speculate freely. I can conjecture that there are many alien civilizations out there right now, even in our neighborhood, and we haven't seen them. And I can now try to talk about why we haven't seen them and what they might be like. And of course, since this is a whole Bitcoin series, I want to connect them back to Bitcoin. I want to make the claim that if they're out there, they're like us and they're using Bitcoin. On some level, it's kind of like the idea that Bitcoin and blockchains, obviously, they're obviously not using Bitcoin like our version of Bitcoin, but they're using something that looks like Bitcoin, right? It's a proof of work blockchain. And part of like why I think that's important.
You're taking it as a natural evolution, right? If life forms evolve from single cell, maybe they always evolve in some form of ocean. Eventually they're going to find a way to get out of the ocean, so they get like the little wings, and then they come to the land and they can breathe oxygen, and then they need arms and legs, opposable thumbs, a brain. Like all that stuff is kind of maybe natural. Who knows if they have the same organ structure, right? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. All that stuff is way over my head. But also, if it becomes intelligent life, then it discovers technology, whether that's like a hammer and then fire, and then ultimately like the microprocessor. And I guess there's that assumption they eventually get to the point of money, and they get to the point of a blockchain. Just before we touch that though, because the Drake equation is quite interesting. I've got it up here. Yes, the aliens are likely around, and 10,000 societies could inhabit our galaxy. Not mentioned to other galaxies, but they're not close. And that's quite interesting.
Might be far away. That's true.
Yeah. But then I think about, do you ever think about that? I was like, do you know what? There may be a planet like fucking way over there, and there's a bunch of like aliens on that planet going through the same shit that we're going through on here, like arguing over bullshit in their own little world. But like, wouldn't it just be great to see it?
I would put it up like, for much of my life, it's been one of the most interesting questions that I've always wondered about. Like, I'm not a big wonderer about does God exist or not exist. I feel like the terms there are not well defined. But I constantly wonder about whether aliens exist or not exist. Maybe that says more about me than anything else. Recently, I've started to wonder a lot more about who the hell is Satoshi. And it's become like my fast running number 2 mystery that I think about in the shower. But for many years, the Fermi Paradox and just where are they and are they like us? I think many people who don't think about this often, like maybe don't feel this way, but I certainly feel that like if we found a signal, if we detected them, if we had direct proof that they're out there and they're even like us in any way, like we can communicate with them at all, it would be like the most important scientific discovery of history. Like I feel comfortable saying that. Many other people would disagree, and that's fine. People have different priorities, but to me, it changes what it means to be human on some level. Like we're suddenly not the universe. We're one planet and we're one tribe. And I'm not an idealist. I don't think it brings us all together in a kumbaya way. I think it's going to cause all sorts of crazy shit to go down on our planet in the short term. But maybe long term, like just knowing how we fit into the universe more broadly will help us understand where we're supposed to go, what we're supposed to do. I kind of feel like we're a little bit we're foundering or something, right? Like we've lost direction in some way. I think about like everywhere we went on planet Earth, there were humans that we found when we got there, no matter who we were, whether we were colonials or colonized rather. People are everywhere on Earth, pretty much. And for much of human history, we assumed that they were out there, like in space when we looked. There's a cool, maybe it's apocryphal, there's a cool like contest, like when radio was first invented and like started to come out in like the early part of the 20th century or the late 19th century. So early on, there was like this reward for like, can you send signals to space, radio signals, and can you get a response? And you win a certain amount of money if you get a response from an alien civilization. Oh, but it can't be the Martians because the Martians obviously exist. And so that would be too easy. And so this was like the terms of the contest that was created, which I just felt was so cute because it reflected such a belief that we no longer have. Because what actually happened is once we got good at space, we went up there and we're like, all these worlds are dead. There's nothing out here. There's no signals. We're completely alone. And I think maybe it created this weird like existential panic in our species that like, oh my God, we have no idea what the point of universe or existence is any longer. Like we're completely alone and we're just a random accident and this is what it is. And I sometimes believe that if we were to discover that there are other beings out there, in fact, maybe many of them, it would, give us maybe again not directly a purpose, perhaps, but it would contextualize what it means to be human in a way that we again used to have. Like we're part of a universe of life, and like the universe is alive and it's for life. It's not random. We're not an accident. Like it's common and meaningful. Therefore, I don't know. That's starting to get a little philosophical.
Well, yeah, but I think about it in both ways. I think about it because I'm a bit of a space nerd. I love all this geeky shit, and I think about it both ways. Like, if we are an accident, if we hadn't happened, or we destroy it, what a fucking bunch of morons we are. But what an amazing accident to happen, right? Like this is probably like back to my uni days of smoking loads of weed. But I used to think about like, firstly, you have to have the Big Bang, right? Which nobody can really explain itself. And then you have to have billions and billions of years, and at some point there's a creation of the Earth, right? And then the Earth has to have all this perfect environment for the creation of life, and then life has to create it, and then up through the single cells, up to fish, to whatever, dinosaurs. Eventually we get to the humans, right? And then humans procreate, and 2 by 2, like all the way to this point where I was fucking born, right? Like the chance of any of us being alive and existing right now at this moment is so ridiculously small, it's incalculable. So why the fuck are we such a bunch of morons? Like, why don't we appreciate it more? Because the chance of any of us being alive at this moment is so rare. But then at the same time, I think about these other civilizations. Like, are we an experiment? If these other civilizations exist, are we in a zoo? Yeah, are we the human zoo? Are we was it Musk who said, like, if you can create simulations, we're most likely a simulation. Like mathematically, we're most likely. I still don't believe we're a simulation. But like all these things I think about, and I wonder if there's these other civilizations, and like I wonder if they just go through the same struggles, conflict, war, that everywhere. If that's a natural, as gravity is natural in the universe, that's natural as part of the cycle of any form of life. Or if we are really just a bunch of dickheads. I can't figure it out.
I think that's part of what I spent some time talking about in the article. There's some things have to be kind of universal. Like we have to all experience gravity and light and energy usage and thermodynamics. It's hard to imagine life not respecting those kinds of boundaries. Certain things, even surprising things, may be universal, like the mechanism of genes or DNA or cellular metabolism, like ATP synthase or what you like. Like these things are evolved on Earth very quickly, and it could be that the reason they evolved quickly is because they're very likely to occur in the right circumstances. And so maybe we wouldn't be surprised when aliens are made of DNA just like us, because how else would you make life? That's the simplest and easiest way to do it. It may be. We don't know. I think conversely, though, there's lots of reasons to suspect that they may be vastly different, especially as life grows and complexifies. Like we are a society of individuals, which is almost the definition of the human condition, is like we're all the same, but we're all in competition with each other. And that just is the joy and strife of life. And we've all seen in science fiction, the hive mind, where everybody is like the same individual. Does that society have the same conflicts that our individual members experience? So I think there's room to entertain that like life can be really, really different. But we can also entertain the idea that maybe there are certain universal selection pressures and efficient choices that life routinely makes. And if it's common, then we may expect many kinds of life to look or act or experience things that we experience. I'll give you a really an argument that I've heard, which is fun to run through, which is like, why should like all alien civilization or all alien species that we'll communicate with will have eyes pretty much that work like our eyes? Like, why is that? And it's an interesting question. It's like, well, because life really has like if life evolves, maybe it needs liquid water. If liquid water evolves, then like where are you going to find liquid water on the surface of the planet? You're going to only find it in certain kinds of atmospheric pressures and compositions. Those are likely to be clear to space at certain frequencies. So light's going to come in at certain frequencies. That's what created the visual spectrum on Earth. It's like that's like the light that comes in through the atmosphere from the sun. And so maybe these aliens will also have eyes. And so you can run these kinds of just so stories. Oh, and then they'll have telescopes and they'll be able to look at us, and so you can tell these stories to yourself about like how everything will be the same, but you can also say it could be different, right? Like we now know that life might exist inside some of the icy moons of like Europa and Enceladus and our own solar system. Like those are dark places, we think, right, with no light at all. So maybe life doesn't need eyes. So I think there's a sense in which what you believe or project or claim about external life or aliens or whatever, it says a little bit more about what you think you are and what you think is important about humans than almost anything else. So like when I talk about Bitcoin and alien species, I am saying that, hey, these days I think humans, ability to compete and cooperate and use money to solve resource allocation problems is one of the things that defines our society. And that's why it's important to project that out into aliens. And I think people who say that the aliens are zookeepers or that the aliens are, malicious predators that are out there to kill us, they're projecting some aspect of what they think life really is, or they're picking the things that they think are most important and they're elevating those, and then they're using those to make more general predictions. Maybe no one is right. That's really not my claim that certain people are right or wrong here. I'm just trying to recognize that when we speculate like this, we're a little bit looking at ourselves, like we're looking in the mirror more than we're looking out towards the stars.
I think that's the point. We're judging any other any other intelligent life as evolving as we have with the same mistakes and decisions. And who knows, man? I'm with you. I think it's the most interesting question that we face. Like, are we alone? I do. I think that's why everyone talks about it. I think that's why when Elon Musk talks about going to Mars, or Joe Rogan gets like some Air Force fighter jet pilot who saw some weird kind of like tic tac thing that he talked about. I think we all get drawn to it. We're all drawn to this idea. I think it is the most interesting question beyond anything else.
Because we all want to say, I fucking knew it, man. I knew all along they were out there. Like we all feel it. Not all, but some of us feel like the opposite. But many people do feel like it's got to be true, right? And so we're just waiting for the evidence to show up a little bit. So I think it's partly under that kind of a model where I'm just like, look, okay, so I'm looking in the mirror and I'm saying, what's cool about humans? It's Bitcoin. And that's what I want to talk about. So I'm going to say they have Bitcoin, and I'm going to motivate that because I think it's natural for them to have Bitcoin. Like, we talked about stories that we can tell ourselves that convince us that they'll be like us and why. And I try to tell some of those stories, right? Like, hey, if they're a society of individuals, they're going to need language, and money and language co-evolve. And so they're going to find money. And if they find money and if they're talking to us and they're the source of an alien signal, they have, telecommunications technology and they have computers, because otherwise how are they sending us signals? And if they have those things and they also have money, well, then why didn't they discover Bitcoin? Like they have everything they need to discover Bitcoin. Are we so clever that only we could discover Bitcoin? Or is, like evolution, like does a technology emerge when, the society needs it and all the prerequisites are present, because inevitably someone then invents that thing, right? So I think under that model, I sort of suspect that like if they're anything like us, even in the broadest strokes, and they're able to develop technology and like they're a society of like individuals with conflict, like they're going to find Bitcoin one day.
I think that's a really good, dude. I think this has been my favorite show I've ever fucking made.
Thank you. I enjoy talking about Bitcoin with other space nerds.
Well, do you know, I don't smoke weed anymore. I kind of felt like we should have done this with a bong in Texas, maybe some whiskey. We're definitely going to talk about this when the planes are flying. Do you go anywhere else with this? Is there anything? Look, I think you and I we're going to do like an open discussion about this at Clubhouse at some point, right? But like,
that's right. We're going to get something scheduled.
Yeah. Are you going to go anywhere further with this? Is there anything? Because like I'm super interested in more of a realistic exploration of the first part at a technical level. I'm really interested in that personally. As I said before we started talking, that bit is relevant. That might be relevant in our lifetime.
Whereas, yes, no, I agree.
Unless I cryogenically freeze myself, and the potential is, that's kind of like a good hodl strategy to cryogenically freeze yourself and come out in like a few hundred years. be trillionaires.
You have to, I think we explode ourselves right now when we freeze them. So you kind of got to assume that the guys in the future will be able to fix that for you, but sure. Yeah.
But yeah, so where are you going anywhere else with this? Is this done? I've done this. I'm moving on. I'll say anything else.
I mean, on some level, I feel like I am a little bit done. Like I've been thinking about all these issues for a good number of years, and it took me some time to like just sequence it all out, kind of get all my thoughts out on paper, and create a little bit of a discussion space for other people that are interested in stuff like this. I don't know that I have too much more original to say right now on these topics. Certainly not in a popular sense. I think I speculated enough. I want to speculate about some other things now. I really want to get back to some more Bitcoin core stack stuff. I think there's a lot of things interesting in the Lightning Network and other places that I want to start writing about a little bit more. But there is one area that I have been developing is like, especially to me, what was interesting about part one was how hard, if you like, the result was. That it was really, I did a simulation, and I feel like you can disagree about Martians will create Musk coin. You could disagree about whether Bitcoin is the most important coin or whether we'll have hyperbitcoinization or whatever. But it's challenging, I think, for someone to disagree with the claim that Bitcoin, as currently conceived, will not work outside of a certain distance from Earth, at least not for mining. I think that's pretty incontrovertible based on the simulation that I've done now. But a simulation is not as good as other kinds of arguments, perhaps. I'm working on a more analytic treatment that tries to sort of say, hey, look, here's the math and here's all the ingredients, and this is why you can prove that, the simulation produced that result, right? That looks like kind of an exponential decay, and like there has to be like some equation that tells me the same thing. So I want to start talking a little bit more about like a theory of how blockchains converge over space and time. Again, not because it's super relevant today to Bitcoin, but it just might be in a few decades as we start to actually think more seriously about getting to Mars. So I want to spend a little bit more time on that stuff. But no, overall, I feel like I'm kind of done. I put out a lot of like weird, speculative, crazy. These are long, difficult to get through articles. If you're, I imagine most people just skim them and just like look at some of the pictures and like some of the quotes and stuff, and that's totally fine. Like I don't intend for them to be like they're not very actionable, let's put it that way. But I do think that there's enough content in them for folks who particularly are interested in space and the Fermi Paradox or Bitcoin and blockchains, and especially where all these things intersect. I think there are a lot of people at the intersection of being interested in astronomy and space and aliens and Bitcoin and futurism more generally. So I think if you're in that intersection, like come back to these as you occasionally think about Bitcoin and space and stuff. And I think you'll find that there's a lot that's in there to serve as a good point for starting off discussions. I also totally would love if someone were like to actually really fictionalize this. Like I think it would be really cool to watch. Like at this point, I feel like I would want to watch a TV show about like this, what happens on Mars 50 years from now, like while this stuff gets unloaded. That's a little bit of a high hope. I don't think anybody's going to do that, but that would be cool. I would like that. I think the proudest I have felt is when some folks have read these articles and been like, this is really good science fiction, because I love science fiction. I think that's high praise. So hopefully someone makes it really science fiction.
Well, like I said to you, like for me, it was two things. It was accurate theorizing. It was accurate theories about what happens with Bitcoin in space, but it also was a bit of science fiction. I read the first part. I've read every word of the first part twice. I read it the first time you sent it, and I was just glued to it. So the first time you posted it, and then I read it again for this, and I've also listened to Guy Swan narrate it, because I love listening to Guy Swan narrate stuff. I just did Gigi's book that he narrated as well. He's so good. I've read every word of part 2. Part 3 was more of a skim, because I was like, as I went through it, I was like, okay, I get this, but I'm so far removed from the bits I care about. So I just thought plus I didn't understand it all. I thought I'd let you shoot the shit. The only other thing you're going to face is I almost guarantee every other podcast is now going to want you on to discuss this, because it is fucking fascinating.
Talk about Bitcoin in space. Well, I love talking about Bitcoin in space, so I'm excited about that. I think folks in my company will be annoyed that why aren't I talking about Unchained and all our amazing products and our concierge onboarding program that I'm supposed to promote and I want everybody to check out, because if Bitcoin is going to space, let's put it this way, you don't want to lose your Bitcoin. So I think sometimes people part of what takes me a really long time to get these things out is that this is not my job or something I even do full time. This is like when I can sneak in a few hours, like or I've had an inspiring thought. I'm like, oh, I got to write that down. Then this stuff gets done. And I think Parker suffers from this too. Part of me wishes that Parker could just write all day long I'm sure the audience, is familiar with Parker Lewis, but like, he's such a good and compelling and interesting writer. And I've learned so much from reading a series that part of me is just like, could you just do that? But then I'm like, no, don't do that, because you are an incredible coworker, and like Unchained, without you, it would be a very less successful business. And so it's awesome when we have folks who are incredible employees and really shift the ball forward at work, but who also like are writing stuff that I think is like, especially in Parker's case, I think that's going to last a long time. Like, they're going to be reading that on Mars when they're plotting Muskcoin.
Well, I agree with you on Parker. I mean, his Gradually Then Suddenly series is phenomenal, and I'm talking to him about doing a series with him based on that, because it is so good. I think what you've done at Unchained, you've just built a really great team of actual Bitcoiners. Like, other companies have done a really good job of bringing people in outside of Bitcoin to bring a different perspective, but you've got a really good core team of Bitcoiners. And one of the saddest things about the pandemic is the lack of travel. I used to get to visit you guys. Like, I used to get to drop into your office every 2 to 3 months, come and have a steak, come and have a beer, and I haven't seen you guys for over a year, and that's sad.
It's still happening. We do a lot of bit dev. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, we do a lot of Austin bit dev meetups, and they're increasingly well attended, which I do find kind of shocking, considering I think a lot of people are still staying home. Austin is an incredible place to be running a Bitcoin company, and it's not just Unchained Capital, though I am really proud of us for being a pretty central node in the Austin Bitcoin community. There are a lot of folks who are just coming there, and I think it's like that mix of Texas, like maybe income tax situation. There's climate. There's clean California. There's the Shelling point idea of like more and more people come here, so more and more people come here, and indeed we were able to even get you to swing by, and we got steaks, and I'm looking forward to that stuff coming back online like much more. But it's exciting to see nonetheless how much enthusiasm is here, even with the pandemic going on. People, I think sometimes at Unchained we conjectured that there was an effect of like, if a lot of people had a bit more time at home, maybe they started to take a bit more care with their finances and their Bitcoin stuff. Maybe there's a lot of stuff they were meaning to do, like get into a multi-sig collaborative custody setup with Unchained, that they were like putting off for a little while. As soon as the pandemic hit last year, we saw a huge increase in folks coming and signing up and kind of taking the next steps. Again, I do think a big part of that was driven by fear and monetary changes and people reacting to government policy perhaps as well. And a big part of it was due to how much effort we put in on our concierge onboarding. But it's been an interesting pandemic, blessings and curses all around.
Yeah. Well, every time I have a conversation with Parker over Telegram or Twitter, he always says, when you move into Austin, I'm like, dude, it is a serious consideration, man.
Parker's good at getting people to move to Austin.
The only I have the complexity of children to consider, but I did say to the kids either way, they want to get back to the States. They love it. So we're going to have a holiday there potentially if we can fly this summer. And I said, look, you guys have got to come to Texas. I've got to take you to Texas, and maybe we'll swing by and hopefully I get to see you guys again, because I want some barbecue. I don't want to see you guys. I don't want a whiskey. And
that's the real reason. Peter just misses the barbecue and the steaks.
You know what it's like. You get to drop by Austin. I get to drop by your offices, and you always kindly let me use them to do interviews, which I'm always grateful for. But I also get to see Jimmy. I always get to see a few people, and I just love it. So fingers crossed, man. Funny enough, today I actually accidentally signed up to the beefsteak next month, and I can't even go. I thought it was the Miami one I was signing up to, so like a moron. But I hopefully soon. And listen, I'm humbled that you let me do this. We talked about it quite a while ago. No, dude, but anytime, man. I've absolutely loved this. I flat out say now, this is one of my favorite show I've ever made. It's that intersection of science fiction and Bitcoin, like two of my favorite things. I can't. The only other thing I need is Lamborghinis in here, and then I've got everything I give a shit about all in one interview. I just can't make the Lambos work, but I'm humbled you let me do it. I'm going to share this out with everyone. I'm going to try and encourage people to read at least parts 1 and 2 before they do it. Hopefully, all 3 parts, and I just can't wait to get out there. So thanks, brother.
All right, Peter. Thank you.
Well, listen, all the best. Keep crushing it with Unchained, and hopefully I'm going to see you soon, man.
See you soon.